For months, whispers echoed through Buckingham Palace, unanswered questions, cancelled appearances, and an unsettling quiet that felt heavier than any royal scandal. The press called it a private medical matter, but insiders knew something was deeply wrong. When King Charles finally emerged, pale but defiant, the truth he revealed sent tremors across the monarchy. His silence had been strategic, but what it concealed was darker than anyone imagined. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began quietly, almost deceptively so. Official statements brushed off concerns, assuring the public that the king was resting or attending to private engagements. Yet those who have followed the monarchy for years sensed a break in the rhythm, a strange dissonance between the palace's reassurances and the palpable unease beneath them. State visits were abruptly cancelled, including one to Canada that had been planned for months. Behind the gilded gates, the air grew thick with worry. Servants whispered of late-night consultations, of doctors ushered in through side doors, and of the Queen's growing impatience with the secrecy. The monarchy's eerie quiet only deepened speculation. Courtiers moved with visible tension, and even senior royals seemed uncertain about what to say or what not to. Every public appearance became a test of endurance for the king, his expression carefully composed but his energy unmistakably drained. The cameras could not hide what words refused to admit. Something was seriously wrong. The press caught on fast. Rumors of a grave diagnosis spread like wildfire, with tabloids circling like vultures around every absence and faint smile. And through it all, Buckingham Palace remained firm in its silence, refusing to confirm or deny. Queen Camilla's retreat from public life added fuel to the fire. Once commanding the spotlight with practiced grace, she suddenly vanished from engagements. Some said she was shielding her husband, others believed she was hiding the truth. The optics were disastrous. Britain's monarch and his queen disappearing at the same time invited only one conclusion. The situation was far worse than anyone dared to say. Royal correspondents began reporting that unseen forces were shaping the narrative, ensuring that no mention of the king's health would reach the public unfiltered. The monarchy had chosen silence, but that silence was cracking under its own weight. And yet, within that silence, something else stirred an emotional storm no public statement could contain. The king's siblings were divided on how to handle the growing crisis. Princess Anne, ever pragmatic, urged transparency. William, protective of both his father and the crown, pushed for controlled messaging. But Charles, stubborn as ever, refused to be defined by illness or pity. He believed the throne demanded endurance, even as his body faltered under the strain. The tension within royal circles became impossible to disguise. What had begun as caution was morphing into fear, a fear that the king's condition, and the monarchy itself, might not survive what was coming. The public, once indifferent, grew restless. Social media erupted with speculation, hashtags demanding truth from the throne. Outside the palace, flowers and letters began to appear, a haunting echo of another time when Britain mourned in uncertainty. The collective anxiety of a nation mirrored the turmoil within the royal walls. Everyone knew a statement was coming, but no one could predict what shape it would take. What the king would soon reveal would not just define his reign, it would expose the heart of a family fractured by secrets and burdened by the weight of a centuries-old institution. But when the king finally decided to speak, his confession wasn't just about an illness, it was about betrayal, fear, and a family on the edge of collapse. The moment came in a trembling voice broadcast from Windsor King Charles, his composure faltering, revealing that he had been battling a form of cancer kept hidden for months. But what stunned the nation wasn't the illness, it was the revelation that his condition had worsened due to choices made within his own household. The cameras caught not a king, but a father and husband caught between duty and survival. When the broadcast began, no one expected the gravity of what was about to unfold. The king sat before the nation, not as the untouchable sovereign history had built him to be, but as a man cornered by truth. His voice carried the weight of months of concealment, his tone marked by exhaustion and sorrow. "I have been receiving treatment for a condition that has tested not just my body, but my faith," he confessed, his words trembling yet deliberate. The phrase progressive and aggressive echoed through the room, each syllable striking, like a hammer against centuries of royal stoicism. For the first time in modern memory, the British monarch was not announcing a new era or policy, but his own vulnerability. The world stood still. Within minutes, every major network switched to live coverage. Analysts scrambled for answers while the public, glued to screens, tried to absorb what they had just heard. Some wept openly, others refused to believe it. The royal image so carefully crafted over decades was suddenly stripped bare. Behind the grandeur and ceremony was a man fighting for his life. Yet what unsettled many wasn't just the diagnosis, it was the way he spoke about the circumstances that had led him there. In veiled but unmistakable words, he hinted at conflicts of obligation and pressures within the family that had complicated his treatment. That single implication detonated across headlines. Had the king's condition worsened because of those closest to him? Inside the palace, the fallout was immediate. Communications staff scrambled to release clarifications, desperate to contain what they called a misunderstanding. But it was too late. The damage was done. Every press outlet dissected his phrasing, replaying the trembling tone in slow motion, searching for meaning. The royal PR machine, so adept at control, was collapsing in real time. Insiders whispered that the address had bypassed several layers of palace approval, that the king himself had insisted on speaking directly, unfiltered, refusing to let his words be rewritten or softened. For once, he had spoken from pain, not protocol, and that act of defiance changed everything. Within the family, the reactions were as divided as the nation's. Prince William reportedly broke down upon hearing the truth, overwhelmed by both fear and guilt for not seeing the severity sooner. Princess Anne, his ever-loyal sister, was said to have been furious that the palace had let the matter reach this point, blaming internal chaos for the king's suffering. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's silence was deafening. In the public eye, she appeared supportive, but behind palace doors, her distance only fueled suspicion. Commentators began asking difficult questions. Had the Queen known more than she let on? Had her desire to maintain royal appearances cost the king precious time? Public sympathy quickly turned to collective grief, then to something darker, doubt. How long had they been lied to? How much of what they saw in smiling photographs and perfectly worded statements had been a facade? For every tear shed in compassion, there was another laced with anger. The royal household, once revered for its unity, was now facing its most human crisis, yet a king undone, not only by disease, but by the very world he had built to protect his legacy. Yet, amidst the heartbreak, Charles's words carried an undertone of warning, almost prophetic. It wasn't just an admission, it was an awakening. He seemed to be hinting at something greater. Something the palace had fought to bury for months. A truth that went beyond his health, reaching into the core of what the monarchy had become. And though his confession earned him the world's sympathy, it also opened doors that the institution had long kept sealed. But behind the king's brave words lay a deeper truth, one that had been buried in silence, until his doctors warned that it could no longer stay hidden. As the world rallied behind the monarch, the palace itself became a battlefield. Old alliances crumbled. Prince William demanded answers, while Camilla's icy composure only fueled whispers that she knew more than she admitted. What should have united the royal family instead exposed cracks so deep they threatened to swallow the crown itself. In the wake of King Charles's televised confession, the mood inside Buckingham Palace shifted from grief to quiet hostility. The royal household, once bound by centuries of unspoken order, now resembled a fragile empire collapsing under its own secrecy. What began as compassion for the king's illness turned into a power struggle, as factions formed behind closed doors, each with its own vision for the monarchy's survival. Prince William, shaken by his father's admission, pushed for immediate transparency. He demanded full disclosure of the king's condition and succession plans, believing that silence would destroy what little trust remained between the crown and its people. Yet every attempt to move forward was met by resistance from none other than Queen Camilla. Her calm demeanour hid something colder, something deliberate. She argued that the monarchy could not afford another crisis, that revealing too much would weaken the institution beyond repair. To William, her words sounded less like wisdom and more like manipulation. Charles, still reeling from his public revelation, was caught in the crossfire between duty and devotion. His health had made him vulnerable, and both his son and his wife knew it. One wanted to protect the throne, the other to preserve control. The king's private meetings with William grew tense, often ending with silence rather than resolution. Anne, ever the loyal sister, emerged as the quiet protector in the midst of turmoil. Unlike the others, she did not seek power. She sought stability. She believed that the monarchy's survival depended not on secrecy, but on truth. Yet even she could not ignore the unease that lingered around Camilla, an unease that many within the palace had begun to voice openly. Then came the leaks. Anonymous staff members began speaking to the press, revealing that the palace was in chaos. Memos surfaced, suggesting that internal discussions had already begun regarding the king's potential abdication if his health declined further. Worse still, those memos hinted that Queen Camilla had been quietly lobbying for certain titles and responsibilities to be transferred under her control, should Charles be forced to step back. The optics were devastating. To the public, it looked like the monarchy was eating itself alive. To those inside, it was proof that loyalty had become conditional and trust non-existent. Every corridor of the palace seemed to hum with tension. Meetings that once lasted minutes stretched into hours, filled with veiled accusations and forced smiles. William's frustration boiled beneath his polished exterior. He wanted to protect his father, but he could no longer ignore the feeling that Camilla was keeping something from him, something tied to the king's condition. When the press caught wind of these growing divisions, headlines screamed of a fractured crown. Public faith wavered. What was once a symbol of unity now appeared broken beyond recognition. Charles tried to reconcile the people he loved most, but his attempts only deepened the divide. Every word of reassurance seemed to echo in an empty chamber. The monarchy, built on centuries of hierarchy and obedience, was being torn apart not by rebellion from the outside but by silence and suspicion from within. As whispers of betrayal grew louder, one thing became certain. The battle for control of the palace had only begun. But if the palace was divided now, the next revelation would turn that division into open war, a revelation that tied Charles's illness to betrayal from within. An anonymous source from the king's medical team leaked what no one dared to admit publicly, that Charles's condition had worsened after a series of stress-inducing events orchestrated by those closest to him. The king's body may have been fighting disease, but his spirit was under siege. His doctors begged him to step away from the pressure. Instead, he chose confrontation. The leak hit like a thunderclap. For weeks, the monarchy had managed to control the narrative, projecting strength, unity, and hope. But this revelation shattered that illusion entirely. Medical staff once sworn to silence had broken ranks, claiming that emotional turmoil, not just biology, had accelerated the king's decline. In private medical notes, later quoted by an insider, one phrase stood out like a warning etched in stone. Psychological distress remains the primary concern. What kind of distress could be so consuming that it endangered the life of a monarch? And who within the palace had caused it? Behind closed doors, panic rippled through the royal corridors. Senior courtiers scrambled to identify the source of the leak, while public concern turned into outrage. For the first time, the British people began questioning not just the king's health, but the environment surrounding him. Reports began to surface of high-pressure meetings, sleepless nights, and relentless demands placed upon him despite his condition. And though no one dared say her name aloud, all eyes turned toward Queen Camilla. Her composure, once admired, now appeared calculating. Anonymous insiders hinted that her insistence on maintaining appearances, pressuring the king to attend events, smile for cameras, and uphold tradition had pushed him to the brink. The monarchy's motto of endurance had become a slow form of self-destruction. Doctors close to the king had reportedly warned him repeatedly to slow down, to let his body recover in peace. But Charles, shaped by decades of expectation and duty, refused to yield. He viewed retreat as weakness, and weakness as betrayal. The nation needs to see stability, he told his aides, even as his strength faded day by day. Those closest to him could see it, the tremors in his hands, the fatigue that lingered in his voice, but he pressed on, convinced that the crown demanded nothing less. His defiance became his burden, and that burden became his undoing. The palace, still fractured by internal feuds, made things worse. Every whispered argument between William and Camilla, every strategic meeting about succession, weighed heavily on him. Insiders described a man torn between two realities, the one he had to uphold before the world, and the one collapsing in private. Even Princess Anne, his most steadfast ally, struggled to reach him. Her warnings were gentle but clear. You can't lead if you destroy yourself in the process. But Charles would not listen. His faith in perseverance blinded him to the cost it carried. As the weeks passed, the nation's sympathy turned into anxiety. Each public appearance was analyzed for signs of decline, every rare smile dissected like an omen. The king's once firm image of resilience had begun to look more like desperation. When the story of his medical defiance broke his refusal to rest, his obsession with control, the world saw not strength, but tragedy. This was no longer just a tale of illness. It was a story of pride, pressure, and the unbearable loneliness of leadership. Made the choice that would define the next chapter of his reign. That decision to keep fighting publicly while crumbling privately would lead to one of the most haunting royal moments in modern history. The cameras rolled during what should have been a routine event, a visit to a children's hospital, but the nation witnessed something else entirely. King Charles faltered mid-speech, his voice breaking, his hand trembling. The footage went viral in minutes, symbolizing not just human frailty, but a monarchy teetering on emotional collapse. It began innocently enough. The king, still recovering from treatment, had insisted on fulfilling his royal duties, despite warnings from his doctors and pleas from his family. To him, duty was medicine, his proof to the world that he remained unbroken. But as he stood before the children, reading a message of hope and perseverance, something within him gave way. His words stumbled, his gaze dropped. For a moment that felt eternal. The man once hailed as Britain's unwavering monarch looked fragile, lost, and achingly human. The nation watched in stunned silence as the king's pain spilled into the public eye. His aides rushed to his side, but the damage was done not to his body, but to the monarchy's image of indestructible strength. Within hours, the video flooded global networks. News anchors spoke in hushed tones. Headlines read, "The King breaks down." Public sentiment shifted almost instantly from admiration to heartbreak. The world that had once seen him as a symbol of endurance now saw a man consumed by the burden of leadership. Social media exploded with messages of sympathy, yet behind every kind word lay a growing fear. Was this the beginning of the end? The British people had seen their Queen age gracefully through crisis, but Charles's collapse felt different. It wasn't an act of defiance, it was a cry for help. Inside the palace, chaos erupted. Catherine and William were said to be devastated, both out of concern for his health and the magnitude of what it meant for the crown. William reportedly cancelled engagements and rushed to Windsor, demanding clarity on his father's condition. Catherine, ever the peacemaker, urged calm but could not hide her tears. In stark contrast stood Queen Camilla, who maintained her usual poise, addressing the press with a single, rehearsed statement about the king's temporary exhaustion. Her composure was seen by many as cold. Commentators called it tone-deaf, fueling suspicions that tension within the palace had reached breaking point. Palace aides scrambled to control the narrative, issuing statements about overexertion and ongoing recovery. But no amount of damage control could erase what the world had already seen. For the first time in modern royal history, the monarch's emotional collapse had been captured unfiltered. The symbolism was undeniable. A kingdom whose foundation rested on composure and duty now faced the undeniable truth of mortality. The palace's attempts to suppress the story only made things worse. Every silence was treated as confirmation that something catastrophic had unfolded behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the king's retreat from the public eye deepened the unease. For days, he made no appearances, issued no statements, and ignored all official business. Those close to him described a man overcome by exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. He had spent decades preparing for the throne, only to find that the weight of it was heavier than anyone could have warned. The isolation that followed was deafening. Royal correspondents began to speak of a king haunted by his own endurance, while insiders whispered that he was questioning everything: the role, the sacrifices, even his trust in those around him. And yet, in that silence, something unexpected was brewing beyond the palace walls. The world thought Charles was alone in his grief, but someone had been watching from afar, someone who understood the toll of family fractures and the price of royal duty. Rumors began to circulate that the estranged son, long absent from royal life, had made contact. The monarchy, broken and vulnerable, was about to face a reunion that would change its course forever. Yet as the king retreated into isolation, one figure emerged from the shadows with an offer that would change everything: his estranged son, Prince Harry. Against every prediction, Harry flew back to Britain unannounced and unguarded. The reunion was not warm, but necessary. For the first time in years, father and son stood face to face. Sources described it as a meeting filled with tears, anger, and truth. But the real shock wasn't their reunion. It was what Harry revealed about who had tried to keep him away during the king's darkest hour. His arrival was quiet, almost defiant in its simplicity. There were no official statements, no security convoys, no royal acknowledgement. He landed in London under the radar, carrying the weight of years of estrangement and the guilt of absence. For months, Harry had remained distant, physically and emotionally, believing that his presence would do more harm than good. But the sight of his father's trembling voice on television changed everything. He could no longer stay away. The fractured son returned to a family still bleeding from its own divisions. The reunion was tense. When Harry entered Windsor, the silence between him and his brother was suffocating. William, torn between duty and resentment, greeted him with a restrained nod. They had both imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never under such tragic circumstances. Every word felt cautious, every breath heavy with unspoken pain. Yet beneath the frost, there was something else, an unspoken understanding that they were both sons before they were princes. What neither of them knew was that the meeting they feared most, the one with their father, would shake the monarchy to its core. When Charles finally saw his son, years of bitterness collapsed in an instant. The king's voice, still weak from treatment, trembled as he whispered Harry's name. There were no speeches, no rehearsed lines, only the raw exchange of emotion between two men who had both suffered in silence. Charles, always the stoic monarch, allowed tears to fall freely, and for the first time in decades, the monarchy looked unmistakably human. Those who witnessed the moment later described it as both heartbreaking and healing. But even as forgiveness lingered in the air, a new tension began to form. Camilla's reaction. Her fury at Harry's sudden arrival was immediate and unmistakable. The Queen, blindsided and humiliated, saw his return not as reconciliation but as disruption. Her cold dismissal during their brief encounter only deepened the rift. Then came the moment that changed everything. In a quiet exchange behind closed doors, Harry presented his father with something that left the king visibly shaken: letters, intercepted and hidden, written by Charles himself. They were messages meant for Harry, never delivered, never acknowledged. Each one carried a father's plea for understanding and a son's stolen chance at closure. The implication was devastating. Someone within the palace had deliberately kept them apart. The more the king read, the clearer it became that this was not a misunderstanding, it was manipulation. The Queen's inner circle, the same advisors who managed royal correspondence, were accused of intercepting those messages under the guise of protecting the crown. That revelation broke something in Charles. The realization that his own words, his private attempts at love, had been filtered, silenced, and hidden tore through him with greater pain than the illness itself. It was a betrayal so intimate it defied forgiveness. William, hearing this, was livid. He confronted palace officials, demanding names, but what he found only deepened the scandal. Every letter, every call, every message meant to bridge a broken family had been turned into a weapon of control. And at the center of it all was a question no one dared to answer aloud. Who had ordered it? In the public's eyes, Harry's return was a moment of redemption, but inside the palace, it was the spark that set the old order ablaze. Reconciliation had opened wounds that could no longer be hidden. The monarchy's attempt to present unity had collapsed under the truth of deceit and silence. The image of father and son embracing was powerful, but it masked the reality of a house still divided, still haunted by secrets. That scandal would explode within days, when newly leaked documents exposed the one person whose actions nearly destroyed the king's chance at recovery. The British press exploded with headlines, "Royal Betrayal Exposed." Leaked documents revealed deliberate interference in the king's treatment schedule. Royal aides traced the obstruction to a senior figure, someone close enough to control every decision. When the name surfaced, Queen Camilla, the monarchy froze in disbelief. The king's own wife accused of delaying his care for the sake of optics and control. The betrayal was not political, it was personal. The documents appeared online in the early hours of the morning, published by an anonymous insider who claimed to have served the crown faithfully for decades. Within hours, the palace was engulfed in chaos. The files were detailed internal memos, medical schedules, and correspondence between royal aides and external consultants. They showed a chilling pattern: appointments postponed, treatments rescheduled, doctors replaced at the last moment. It wasn't coincidence, it was control, and every directive led back to the Queen's private office. The justification, written in neat, careful phrasing, sent shockwaves through the palace. His Majesty must not appear weak in public. The image of stability must be maintained at all costs. Those words, once a simple PR strategy, now carried the weight of cruelty. Camilla's insistence on protecting the royal image had come at a devastating price. The king's suffering had been prolonged for the sake of appearances. For the monarchy's defenders, it was unthinkable. For its critics, it was confirmation of everything they suspected. The public's trust cracked overnight. Behind the palace walls, the emotional fallout was immediate and brutal. William was furious. Insiders reported that he confronted senior aides, demanding to know how far the Queen's involvement went. This wasn't protection, he allegedly said. It was interference. Princess Anne, normally composed, was visibly shaken. She had long defended her brother's marriage as one built on loyalty and maturity, but now even she could not find words to justify what had come to light. For Anne, the betrayal was not only personal, it was institutional. The monarchy's code of duty and sacrifice had been violated by one of its own, and what of the king himself? Those closest to him described a man shattered not by disease, but by heartbreak. When Charles read the documents, his hands trembled. It wasn't just that his wife had interfered, it was that she had done so, believing it was for the good of the crown. The man who had always fought to balance love and leadership now found both collapsing at once. His silence in the days that followed spoke volumes. He cancelled all remaining engagements, retreating into the solitude of Balmoral, leaving behind a palace drowning in speculation. The British public was split down the middle. Some rallied behind the king, calling him a victim of manipulation and misplaced ambition. Others defended Camilla, insisting that she had acted out of fear, not malice, a desperate attempt to shield the monarchy from another era of instability. But for most, sympathy had turned into disbelief. The royal family's carefully guarded image had cracked open once again, exposing a truth that could not be repaired with words or appearances. As commentators debated abdication and the survival of the monarchy, the king's absence only deepened the tension. For decades he had preached transparency and modern reform, but now his silence was deafening. What began as a health crisis had transformed into the greatest moral test of his reign. The betrayal within the crown had not only shaken his throne, it had fractured his heart. But before the nation could process the shock, the king made one final, unexpected move that silenced even his harshest critics. When the world thought the king was defeated, he proved them wrong. Summoning the courage of his ancestors, Charles made a rare address from Balmoral, this time without the crown, without the formality, and without Camilla by his side. His words weren't those of a ruler, they were those of a man who had suffered, fought, and finally, found clarity about who truly stood by him. It was an act no one had foreseen. The palace, still reeling from the storm of scandal, had begged for silence, for time to rebuild. But Charles chose defiance. Without consulting advisors or aides, he arranged a small, private recording, a direct message to the people who had both adored and questioned him. There was no grandeur, no throne behind him, just a man stripped of royal armor, facing a nation that had witnessed his pain. The address began softly, almost hesitantly, as if every word came from a place of exhaustion and truth. "I have not been a perfect king," he confessed, "but I have loved this country more deeply than I have ever been able to say." What followed was unlike anything the monarchy had ever allowed to be heard. Gone were the measured tones of palace-approved speeches. This was raw, trembling honesty. Charles spoke of faith not in ceremony or titles, but in resilience, in forgiveness, in the quiet strength that had sustained him through betrayal. "Sometimes," he said, "the greatest battles are fought in silence, and sometimes silence destroys what love could have healed." The line struck a chord across the world. It was clear that he was speaking to more than just his people. He was speaking to those who had failed him within his own walls. The king did not name names, but the subtext was unmistakable. His subtle pauses, the way his voice wavered when mentioning trust broken by those closest to me, made one thing clear. This was not only a confession, it was a farewell to illusion. By speaking without Camilla's presence, he had drawn an invisible line between them. It was not anger that defined him now, but clarity. For the first time, the public saw Charles not as a monarch overshadowed by scandal, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Across Britain, support surged once more. Even critics who had turned away found themselves moved by his vulnerability. Letters poured in, messages flooded social media, and public vigils formed outside palaces, not in protest, but in solidarity. The people who once doubted his strength now saw a king reborn from disgrace, a figure who had faced betrayal and still chosen compassion over vengeance. His words reminded them of something the monarchy had long forgotten: that its power did not come from titles, but from humanity. Behind the scenes, this speech marked a turning point. William and Anne, who had stood in quiet loyalty through the chaos, became his closest confidants. Their renewed bond symbolized the monarchy's shift from hierarchy to kinship, from silence to survival. Even Catherine, whose calm steadiness had kept the family's public image intact, was said to have been deeply moved. The royal family, fractured for so long, seemed to find a fragile unity once more, not through decree, but through humility. The tone of the monarchy began to change. Gone was the rigid perfection once demanded of its members. What replaced it was something rawer, more human. The king's defiance had not only restored his moral authority, it had reshaped the very idea of royal power. The crown, for centuries a symbol of distance and discipline, now represented endurance and redemption. And though the palace remained cautious, even they could not deny that the king had won something greater than control. He had reclaimed the heart of his people. Yet even in triumph, one question lingered in every heart: would this newfound peace last, or had the monarchy crossed a line from which it could never return? The palace gates remained closed, But the silence outside is deafening. A nation once united in tradition now trembles in uncertainty. The king's courage exposed not just his illness, but the fragile humanity of the royal family itself. As his treatment continues away from the cameras, one truth remains unshakable. The monarchy may endure, but it will never be the same again. In the weeks following his emotional address, the world seemed to move more slowly, as if holding its breath alongside its monarch. The British people, long accustomed to stoicism and ceremony, found themselves moved in ways they could not fully explain. The king's vulnerability had pierced through centuries of royal formality, reminding everyone that beneath the robes and the rituals, there beats a human heart. News outlets replayed his speech endlessly. Commentators spoke of a new kind of monarchy, and across the Commonwealth, there was both mourning and admiration. The image of invincibility had been replaced by something deeper truth, yet with that truth came unease. For the first time in generations, the stability of the crown felt uncertain. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was unlike anything in living memory. Conversations, once whispered behind curtains, were now spoken in cautious tones, even among senior staff. Queen Camilla's influence, once absolute, seemed to evaporate almost overnight. Her name, tied so publicly to the scandals surrounding the king's delayed treatment, became a quiet shadow rather than a commanding presence. She withdrew from public duties, citing the need for privacy, but few doubted the reality her reign beside the king was all but over. Behind closed doors, William and Anne filled the vacuum she left behind, stepping into roles that carried both responsibility and restraint. Their actions reflected not ambition, but duty to protect their father and to protect the crown from further collapse. William, in particular, had changed. Those who saw him privately spoke of a man both humbled and hardened by recent events. Gone was the heir eager to modernize. In his place stood a prince learning the delicate balance between empathy and endurance. He had watched his father suffer for the sake of appearance, and he swore never to repeat that mistake. Every decision, every statement from Kensington Palace was measured with precision, signaling quiet preparation for the throne not out of desire, but necessity. He knew that at any moment, the future could arrive without warning, and when it did, he intended to face it not as the next king, but as the son who had learned from a father's pain. For the public, something remarkable began to unfold. Sympathy, once reserved for tragedy, transformed into loyalty. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, not in protest or gossip, but in prayer. Letters flooded in from across the world, messages of strength, hope, and gratitude. In revealing his fragility, King Charles had rekindled the monarchy's connection to its people. The old image of distance and decorum gave way to something intimate and real. For the first time in years, the monarchy was not being judged by its grandeur, but by its humanity. And in that paradox, its survival found new meaning. Still, beneath the warmth of public support lingered an uneasy truth. The monarchy, though alive, was scarred. The scandals had left wounds that time alone could not heal. The king's health remained uncertain, his family divided by scars of trust, and the nation torn between hope for continuity and fear of collapse. Every headline, every whisper, every silent glance toward Buckingham Palace carried the same question: what comes next? The future of the crown hung delicately, caught between redemption and reckoning. And as Britain waits in silence, one question echoes through the halls of history: can the crown survive when the heart of its king is breaking? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.